Hey guys, well here I am in my lovely kitchen, at the kitchen table. Yeah, the surgery went great, at least I think so. Still hurts, but it's just the getting up and down that hurts, so we'll see. Be a couple weeks before I know for sure one way or the other. Hoping. Anyway, welcome to this webcam on the presidency, and we'll be talking about presidents. Love presidents, they're so much fun. Anyway, they are the most feared position in government. Why are they? Why are they so feared? Because they have so much power. Why do they have so much power? Because so many people vote for them. Presidents are the most the most voted person in American government. They get more votes than anybody. Senators, representatives, governors, etc., etc., etc. Last couple elections, we had around 120 million 120 million people voting for president, and a little over 60 million voted for the winner. So that's a lot of people. But of course, in the grand scheme of things, we got 310 million people in the U.S. So 60 million are telling the other 250 million what to do, in a way, which is why you should go vote. But anyway, although presidents have called for war, president cannot declare war. What entity declares war? I'll give you a second because I know you all know it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yes, the U.S. Congress. You have to have a majority vote from both the House and the Senate in order to get a declaration of war. We've only had a declaration of war 5 times. War with Mexico, war with Spain, War of 1812, World War I, World War II. So there you go. When we select a president, we're basically selecting a leader, in a way, a head cheerleader for the country. They're going to move us in the direction they think that we should be moving. So they're going to select solutions to our problems. Every side, every party has problems, and they're usually the same problems. The question is, how are we going to solve those problems? And some want it one way, some want it another. For example, when we had our deep recession in 2008, 2009, Obama went the same way of FDR, which was basically overspending. He overspent and borrowed quite a bit of money. As we all know, it's about $1 trillion, just tacked right on to our debt. So there we go. Surprisingly, we've only had a few VPs become president through a general election. Now, many VPs have become president through the death or resignation of presidents, but only a few have actually been elected. George H.W. Bush comes to mind. And then there was John Adams and James Madison. Most of the rest, unless my numbers are wrong, and I don't know if they are, but feel free to look them up. But only three VPs have become president through general elections. 16 senators have become president. Now, of course, if Hillary wins, then that will up that number. Obama did when he got elected. McCain would have when he got elected, if he would have got elected. I heard Ted Cruz is going to run on, announce his thing on Monday. If he's elected, he'll bump that number up. 19 governors and 19 House representatives have also become president. Problem with a lot of those is that usually you have a record. And so it's tough to run on your record sometimes. And a lot of times front runners have always been turned down because of their record. And so you get the second choice or the third choice running. And we've had 9 cabinet members become president. So Hillary would actually be a twofer if she gets on there because she is a senator and a cabinet member. So that'd be interesting. But anyway, who can become president officially? The Constitution has 3 qualifications. The first one, of course, is you're a natural-born citizen. I'm already hearing people talk about Ted Cruz as not being a natural-born citizen because he was born in Canada to an American mother and a Cuban father. And he was not brought in as an American citizen for a couple years. They didn't do the paperwork immediately. So some people are quashing his, already hearing some of that. Not just from the Democratic side, but the Republican side as well. I would hope to hear more from those birthers who complained about Obama trying to run for president with the same sort of logic. So if they don't come forward to poo-poo Ted Cruz, then I'll be very disappointed in them as well. Also have to be 35 years of age. We've never had a president in our 30s. The youngest president has been 42. Most people think that was JFK, but it was actually Teddy Roosevelt who took over when William McKinley was shot in Buffalo. He was shaking hands, and somebody did the old shoot him in the gut. Shake your hand, pull a gun, shoot him in the gut. Yeah, I hate that. But anyway, so that's a Who Wants to Be a Millionaire question, or a Jeopardy question. Youngest president ever was Teddy Roosevelt, not JFK. Youngest elected president was JFK. And of course, the oldest was for his second term was Ronald Reagan at 69. Although John McCain would have been the oldest if he would have been elected at 72. And then you also have to be a 14-year U.S. resident. Excuse me. That was thrown in there for people who were here at the when the Constitution went into effect. Generally, we've had college graduates be presidents throughout most of the 20th century and of course, the 21st century as well, except for one. Harry Truman was not a college grad. So we also see a lot of presidents. Over half have been relatives of former presidents. So a lot of interesting stuff there. Probably the most interesting of all, though, is the curse of presidents elected in years ending in 0. They have a tough time getting out of office alive. It started in 1840 with William Henry Harrison. He gave a long speech out in the cold rain. It was in March, and it was a freezing rain. And all he had was an overcoat on, no top hat or a top coat or anything. So he got quite wet. They thought it'd be a short speech, but he droned on for supposedly an hour and a half. He caught a cold, which turned into bronchitis, which turned into pneumonia, and he was dead in 30 days. That's why he's usually on the bottom of the presidential rating scales, because he didn't do anything. He basically announced his cabinet, and that was it. He's not usually at the very bottom, but he's somewhere in the bottom half, basically because of that, just because he didn't do anything. So that was 1840. 1860, we got Lincoln, who had a case of lead poisoning to the head in 1865. Bad stuff there. Then, of course, 1880 was the comic book cat president, Garfield. He was also shot in the gut by a crazy guy, a Mr. Guiteau, who lost his job in government because of, well, there was this big thing going on between patronage and civil service. They wanted you to have experience, not just who you know. Patronage is who you know. Civil service is what you know. And so he lost his job, I think mainly because he was crazy more than anything else. He figured out that if he killed the president, Vice President Chester Arthur would take over, who was a big fan of patronage. So he would bring patronage back. And of course, then he would get hired back. They always hire people who've killed presidents, of course, yes. He was actually taken into custody immediately by the Secret Service, who were there after he shot Garfield in the gut. He was, I think it was about 2 weeks. He was tried, convicted, and hung. So there you go. Good example of American justice. Garfield lingered for about a month, but he got an infection and died shortly thereafter, and Chester Arthur went ahead and made the Pendleton Act, which was institution of civil service, his legacy, so he pushed for that. That was 1880. 1900, well, we've already mentioned that, William McKinley, who was shot in Buffalo, the old shaking the hand, gun in the gut thing again. And then 1920 was William G. Harding, who was actually on vacation. And he was supposed to be relaxing, but then he had a heart attack before they could get him to a hospital. It took him about 3 days or so to get him to a hospital. Basically his heart was pretty well gone by then. His wife supposedly did show up just in time to say goodbye to him, and then he passed away. So there's that. 1940 was FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It actually lasted until 1944. No, sorry, 45. Yeah. In March of 45, he was having his presidential portrait painted for his 4th presidency. He was elected, only president to be elected 4 times. And he got complained of a headache. About 30 seconds later, he keeled over and he was dead before he hit the ground. He had a stroke. And so just massive stroke. Boom. All that pressure. He wasn't looking well that last year either. So 1960, of course, was JFK, who was shot in Dallas. 1980. Most of you don't remember, certainly weren't around when that happened, but Ronald Reagan was shot by a guy trying to impress Jodie Foster, who surprisingly goes the other way, doesn't really care for men. So he was not really going to impress her. Anyway, she didn't even know who he was. But Reagan was shot, and they shoved him in the car. He said he was okay, and then he sort of keeled over to the side because he was in shock and didn't feel it. They took him to Bethesda Hospital, and to his credit, his John Wayne moment, he actually got out of the car under his own power and walked into the emergency room. But as soon as the doors closed, he collapsed on the floor. It was a near thing, though. They took him to the OR and saved him. He was actually waving out the window the next day. Another John Wayne moment for him. Most people don't know how serious it was. It missed his aorta by a hair. Had it nicked his aorta, he would have bled out before he even got to the hospital. So there you go. And then last one, President Bush, 2000. What was his brush with death? Some people say the guy who threw shoes at him. No. There's actually a report of a fake grenade thrown in his direction at some foreign thing they had. Never been able to verify that. But no, the big one was homicidal pretzel. Yeah, he was eating pretzels and drinking beer, watching some sports in one of the rooms of the White House, and he forgot to chew his pretzel before he swallowed. It went into his throat, and the salt on the pretzel just sucked all the beer out, and he was choking. There was a phone right next to him. I suppose he could have picked that up and tried to bang for help or something, because you can't talk when you're choking, for those of you who've never choked. I never have, and I hope I never do. But he could have. But I don't think he was thinking straight. He got up and tried to walk to the door because he knew Secret Service was right out in the doorway. But he keeled over, passed out halfway, not even halfway before he got there. Fortunately, there was a cocktail table on his way down, and he hit his head. So there you go. Come on, boys. Hush. And when he hit his head on the cocktail table, it popped the pretzel out. So he was good. Probably never would have known about it had it not been for the big bandage on his forehead the next day. And everybody started saying, "What's with the bandage, Mr. President?" So there you go. You can divide up the presidency into several different episodes, as you can see from your notes. Chief Clerk is the first one. Ranger, don't make me put you outside. Okay. Chief Clerk, originally it was just about getting the paperwork pushed. Washington himself was just trying to make nice between the bureaucracy and Congress. He was just sort of the go-between. They had to figure out what they were going to call the president. With Washington, they wanted, your excellency, your high exalted greatness, and all this other weird stuff they came up with. He just said, "Mr. President's fine." So there you go. When they asked Washington, "What's your best description of the U.S. president?" he said, basically, mediator of the agencies. Mediator of the agencies. So that was, like I said, he was just mediating between Congress and the bureaucracy. Most people didn't give the president too much, except for foreign policy. They always listened to him on that. Who coined the phrase which this is the correct way, govern is best, which governs least? Most people switch it around these days. Government that's least governs best. But originally that one was, yes, TJ, good old Thomas Jefferson. He was the first conservative president we ever had. Yes, Washington and Adams were actually liberals, kind of. But Jefferson thought we had too much of everything. He cut back on pretty much everything that he could, the military, the judges, the bureaucracy, and all that. But, of course, that all backfired on him later because, of course, his greatest accomplishment was the Louisiana Purchase. And when he doubled the size of the country, he had to double the size of the bureaucracy. So they started out cutting. Later on, he had to make it bigger anyway. He also messed up with the military. He didn't understand that he kept thinking that, fighting for your country was alive and well, and most people don't really want to fight for their country. He basically wanted militias, a militia army, and a militia navy. His militia navy was kind of fun. He had large rowboats with one big gun on it, and that was going to be his militia navy. We would we would build hundreds and hundreds of these little rowboats, and when anybody came to invade, they would sort of come out like bees and fire at the ships with their big gun. What they found out later, though, was it didn't quite work as well as they thought. When they fired to the side, it would capsize the boat. When they fired behind, it would push the boat forward. The only way they could really fire the gun without losing position was to fire straight ahead, pretty much. So they never did do well in the American surf as well. When they took them, a couple of them, over to the Mediterranean, that worked well when we were fighting the Barbary pirates. And then, of course, the militia, never good stuff with the militia. So his greatest accomplishment was Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson really didn't find out about any of this cutbacks on the armed forces until our next war, which was the War of 1812 under Madison. Madison sort of inherited the bad policies of Jefferson, and the British were kind of mad at us, and there was a lot of push from war hawks in Congress to go with this war, so we went with it. Two major problems with the War of 1812. We're talking not enough military and not enough supplies. Even when we had military, we couldn't supply them very well. It was basically a naval war that we did very well on as far as the Navy goes. Even before Jefferson, we had built some frigates, which sort of today would be like heavy cruisers, which did really well in the war. The USS Constitution was one of the best. Had 3 separate fights and won all 3 of them. So our Navy did account for itself really well, just not the militia rowboats as far as that goes. And of course, when the militia had a chance to turn back the British when they invaded Washington, D.C., they didn't do it. And so that's when Madison and Dolly Madison had to grab everything out of the White House and take off right before they were sitting down to dinner. So the British came in, ate their dinner for them, and burned the White House. Tried to burn the Capitol, but that didn't really work too well. They did burn the Library of Congress, and I think Jefferson felt so bad, he actually gave his entire library as the new seed for the Library of Congress. So there. Monroe also used a future president, John Quincy Adams, to help craft his Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was kind of a, you give us this and we'll give you that, sort of a tit for tat, as it were. It basically told all the European countries, you stay out of the Western Hemisphere, in other words, North, Central, and South America, and we'll stay out of Europe and Asia and Africa and all that. So that's really all the Monroe Doctrine did. Congress itself really wasn't worried about foreign policy. It had two matters that it worried about the most: slavery, always trying to keep that delicate balance in Congress, and of course the debt. So not a whole lot went on with that. Anyway. First president to become president without winning the popular vote. A lot of you will think Andrew Jackson, excuse me. No, it was actually John Quincy Adams. Jackson actually ran in that election, but he did get the popular vote. But because of there was like 5 states that they had problems with, Florida being one of them. And they had supposedly a neutral committee go look at all the votes coming in from these states. In order for Adams to win, he had to get all of these states. And Henry Clay was the 3rd person on all of this. Basically said, "Hey, make me Secretary of State, and I'll help get my votes for you." Supposedly, there's never any record of this. They call it the corrupt bargain, and supposedly Adams took him up on it because Clay did become the Secretary of State, and Adams got enough votes because it went to the House of Representatives. And when it goes to the House, whoever gets the most votes wins, and there you go. So Adams became president. Jackson was very, very upset. He actually started a 4-year campaign to become president after that. And he was not very happy when he actually won the presidency because he felt that politics had killed his wife. He tried to keep his wife, Rachel, insulated from politics, and he tried to keep her at the Hermitage, which is what they called their home. But eventually she had to get out and do some shopping and all this. But I guess she was a very delicate thing, or had a fainting problem or something, because supposedly when she was trying on some clothes, the rumor is that she heard some other ladies talking about politics, and they said some nasty things about her sweet, sweet Andrew. And so she fainted. And when she hit the ground, she hit her head and basically cracked her skull and killed her. So Jackson was not very happy when he got into the presidency. And It was sort of like a wake more than anything else. And he let everybody just do whatever. It's the people's house and all this. Eventually, they had to pour all the whiskey in the punch bowl and take it outside because things were starting to disappear. China plate, silverware, stuff like that. So, 3 major accomplishments of the Jackson administration. One was the veto. Jackson used the veto more often than any other president up to this time. So, major use of the veto. He was not happy with Congress and kind of told him by that, with the veto, doing that all the time. Secondly, he killed the U.S. Bank, the second U.S. Bank. It was coming up on a recharter, and they thought if they did the charter early, they might be able to push it through with Jackson's veto, but they couldn't get enough votes to get it through, so Jackson was able to kill it. And then finally, his last one was the spoils system. Created the spoils system. To the victor go the spoils. And so Jackson, when he got into the presidency, basically fired everybody and put his own people in place. And here's where patronage really got started. As long as you knew somebody, Jackson felt anybody could do any government job. So he didn't care about your education background. I mean, look at him. He was just a poor farmer's boy who made it all the way to the presidency. So if he could do it, then anybody could, right? Actually led to a lot of incompetence and a lot of corruption. Supposedly one guy, the worst was one guy who was vetted by the Senate, came in for his first day on the job, wrote himself a check for the entire department's budget, went to the nearest bank, cashed it, got in a boat, was never seen or heard from again. So there we go. When Jackson shows up, he's the last more controversial of the presidents, the one who really speaks out the most. From 1837 to 1900, most people think of them as caretaker presidents, except for a few. Lincoln was certainly not a caretaker president, but most of the others, most people can't remember who was in or who was out or what. Buchanan, right before Lincoln, was probably the best caretaker president we've had up to that time. He never really did much of anything in office. So few stand out. We did have a war with Mexico in 1848, and that was Polk. He's the first what they like to call the dark horse candidate, P-O-L-K, because he went in as sort of the third or fourth choice. The front runners had too much baggage. That could be Hillary's problem in this next election. She's got a lot of baggage named Bill. So that might not help her very much. And so she might actually lose like she did to Obama last time. But we'll see. Polk was, like I said, the third or fourth choice. And he was chosen because he didn't really have much against him. And so he wanted to actually, his campaign slogan was 54-40 or fight. 54-40 meant he was talking about the Oregon Territory, which had been jointly overseen by Britain and America, and we wanted all of it because we were mainly the ones who were up there. He was willing to go to war with Britain over it, but we actually ended up settling that diplomatically. He thought the problem with Mexico was the southern border of Texas, and he thought we'd be able to solve that diplomatically, but we ended up going to war. So, yeah, who knew? What major territories did we get from the war with Mexico? Most people say Texas, but no, we already had Texas. Texas was the focal point because of the southern border of Texas. Mexico said the southern border of Texas was the Nueces River, which I think runs through Corpus Christi. And we said, no, it was the Rio Grande. And of course, in between the Nueces and the Rio Grande is some prime agricultural land, especially with the rivers you can irrigate and all that. So we sent troops, they sent troops, and of course they ended up fighting. As soon as people on both sides were shot, we ended up declaring war on Mexico because of that. Even though we were outgunned at almost every turn, we ended up winning almost every battle with Mexico. We got major states out of it, California, the Arizona territories, and Mexico, or New Mexico, sorry. So those were the three main states we got out of it. Yeah, parts of Utah and parts of Nevada as well, but California, Arizona, and New Mexico were the three states we got from Mexico because of the war with Mexico. So there we go. Lincoln, of course, had the Civil War. He did several things the presidents had never done before, generally because it was an emergency. So he basically went and called out the army without the approval of Congress, which had never really been done before, but he had to because he was afraid that Maryland, which was looking like it might declare for the Confederacy, would cut Washington, D.C. off from the rest of the northern states. So he called out a Missouri militia, or excuse me, a Pennsylvania militia group, who their job was to secure a spot on the Pennsylvania border and create a line of communication all the way to Washington, D.C. and keep it open. And then he called out more troops to basically go to Maryland's capital and make sure that they stayed in the Union, which after 2 weeks of negotiations, they did, kind of negotiations at gunpoint. So he called out the Army without congressional approval. He also called out the Navy without congressional approval. Many southern ports were naval bases. And so Lincoln basically had to, when they declared for the Confederacy, he had to get the ships and supplies out of there as much as possible. So he ordered the ships out. He said, whichever ships you can man, put sailors on them, take anything and everything that's not nailed down that you can fit on them, and destroy the rest. And that's what he did, or that's what they did. And then they turned around and blockaded their own ports after that. So we lost a lot of ships that way. And then number 3 was he suspended habeas corpus. Habeas corpus, a writ of habeas corpus. You cannot be thrown in jail without a charge. If you're thrown in jail without a charge, your lawyer can go to certain courts in your state and demand a writ of habeas corpus, which means that you're brought before a judge, and you better have a really good reason why they're holding you without a charge. And if it's not a good one, then they will release you. Well, he suspended it because of the emergency of the war. Even though it's one of the 3 things written right into our Constitution, the Supreme Court allowed it as long as it came back after the emergency was over. We actually had that occur right after 9/11. Supposedly 600 some odd people were scooped up by the federal government. They were taken and questioned. They were not. They did not ask if, or they would not admit or deny that these people were in federal custody while they asked them questions. After a few months, a lot of them were sent back to their home countries, but about 100 of those 600 were American citizens, and we just said, okay, thanks for answering our questions. Have a nice day. Bye-bye. Can you imagine if you just disappeared for 60 days or 90 days and the government wouldn't say if they had you or not? Yeah, probably wouldn't have a job on the way out either, but at least your family would be happy that you're now there. So anyway. So because of Lincoln, the powers of the presidency were certainly redefined as far as that goes. Modern presidents start in 1901 with Theodore Roosevelt. He took over after the death of President McKinley and mentioned that several times. So hopefully you got that one. And we end up being an isolationist agricultural nation. Yes, hello, Boo-Boo. My cat. Come on, go. Anyway. We started as an isolationist nation, still pretty much agricultural, but by the time World War II is over, we are the most powerful country in the world, and we still are today. So, yeah. Theodore Roosevelt takes over after McKinley is shot. He wants to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. In other words, he wants to be the center of attention. Probably had a narcissistic complex, probably like Tony Stark somewhat. So, anyway. His foreign affairs, he wanted to make sure America was the U.S. policeman, so that, you know, when people have domestic disputes, if you can't settle your own disputes within your own country, we'll come in and help them for you. That's called the Roosevelt Corollary because of that. It's about trade. We want to make sure the country is settled down so we can trade with them. If a country is in the middle of a civil war, trade does not come easy unless, of course, you're a weapons dealer. But other than that, they were expecting a lot from Woodrow Wilson. He was the first president with a PhD, which actually was in political science. He used to teach for, I think it was Princeton in New Jersey, and he was a political science instructor there, became department chair, and then he was president of the college, and then he ran for and became governor of New Jersey. And he didn't really expect to win, but he ran for the presidency because of certain things that were going on at the time, which was the Republicans split their vote between Taft and Teddy Roosevelt, who was running again. Wilson slipped in and got the most votes and enough electoral votes to win. People were expecting a lot from him. They called him the peace president. He kept us out of World War II for his first term, but we got into it his second term. It's a pretty short war for us, only a couple years. And then he actually left the country to go to Europe to negotiate it himself, which was probably a big mistake because he never negotiated anything. He just thought his prestige would take over. And they hemmed and hawed and wrangled and talked about this, that, and the other. And finally, the other delegates just said, well, give me this and we're good with anything else. And then they left and they all started leaving. In the end, he still kept what he wanted, which on the Treaty of Versailles was the League of Nations. He wanted America to join the League of Nations so he could help keep the world safe for democracy, as it were. But that was what many Republicans in the Senate didn't want. They did not want America to join the League of Nations because they wanted to keep us out of that sort of thing. They thought we'd be drawn into more wars, more Americans would be killed for no good reason. Wilson tried to go against that, and he ended up giving himself a stroke. Didn't kill him, didn't really incapacitate him, but he was not in good health for the rest of his presidency, and because of that, he couldn't push for the Treaty of Versailles. It was one of the few that has failed. And we ended up having our own treaty with Germany for that. Best president in the 20th century was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's still in the top three. Generally, people say Lincoln's number one, Roosevelt's number two, and then you go with Washington for number three on your presidential scales. But he created many new bureaucracies to help alleviate many of the symptoms of the Great Depression, which were really hitting us hard. Almost when you go home, or when you go out front to get the mail or something today, look at down your street. Half the people on the left have jobs, the other half don't. Unofficially, about 50% of America's workforce was out of the job. So, three major areas of reform. One big one was going to be Social Security. Yes, hello, boo-boo. Yes, here's my cat. Woo! Never get to do that in class. Social Security was one of his major areas of reform. It wouldn't kick in until people were 52, but of course people were dying in their late 40s, so it really didn't kick in until about 5 or 6 years after most people were dead. That's how it stayed solvent. But of course today it kicks in at 65 at the latest, and of course most people are living to 78 or 80 now, so that's why it's always having a big troubles staying around. So yeah, we'll see. Third major area of reform was the unemployment insurance. Some of you, if you lose your jobs through no fault of your own, you can get unemployment insurance. And that happened to a lot of people during the Great Depression and also during the Great Recession. It's paid for when you're working. You put a little bit of money towards it. They don't pay you a full salary back, but it's enough to get you your basics for a while. You do have to be looking for a job. Like I said, you can't lose your job through no fault. You can't lose it because of some fault on your side. In other words, you quit or you get fired. They won't give you unemployment insurance. But if they aren't paying you, they go bankrupt, they just lay you off for no reason, then you can get unemployment insurance. And then number three, let's see, creation of the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which basically meant that if you put money in a bank, it was going to be insured by the government, so that if the bank failed, you would get your money back, which was a big deal because before the FDIC, if you put money in a bank and the bank failed, you lost it. It was gone. So a lot of people didn't want to put their money in banks, especially during the Great Depression. There were runs on banks, and many banks failed, and a lot of people lost a lot of money, which is why maybe your grandparents had wanted to put money, or great-grandparents had wanted to put their money in their mattresses. They didn't trust banks. But of course today it's insured up to, back then it was $10,000 to start with. Today it's up to $100,000 that you can get money back. But of course it'll take a while to get that money back from the government. But FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, still around today. And there we go. FDR really redefined the presidency not only as an active leader in politics, but also as a military leader. He was not much of a follower, so he wanted to take America to the next level, and he certainly did that. By the time we were finished with World War II, we had the bomb, we had the most gold reserves, we had the most manufacturing, we had one of the biggest armies around, second only to Russia. We had the biggest navy. biggest air force, all this good stuff. Industrial capacity was through the roof. And he decided to get us into the United Nations because he felt that was one of the reasons for World War II, was because we didn't join the League of Nations. So he came up with the United Nations, and that was his legacy, to get us in that. Although he was dead by the time we joined it, we still got into it. So after World War II, we spent a lot of our time addressing communism, or the Cold War. Those damn commies, trying to get things going as far as that goes. Harry Truman spent a lot of time on it as well. He actually gets us started involved in Cold Wars all across the nation because of what's called the Truman Doctrine, where if any country is battling communism and they need our help, we will help them. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Truman Doctrine got us into South Vietnam, for example. We started giving them money when they were attacked by North Vietnam. Under Eisenhower, we sent in instructors. Under Kennedy, we sent in some special forces, and then under Johnson, we sent in regular army, 50,000 plus odd troops, or a couple 100,000 some odd troops. Anyway, LBJ greatly expanded the Cold War. He also tried to create the Great Society. Later on, he said if I could do one or the other, I probably would have succeeded, but trying to do both at the same time really wasn't a good idea. Spending a lot of money trying to keep South Vietnam safe from the North Vietnamese. At the same time, he's also trying to create the Great Society, which is basically a welfare society where the country would take care of you from cradle to grave. Yeah, socialism. Well, we created all these new agencies and tried to do all this stuff, and it really didn't work. We have too much of an independent streak, and a lot of us don't like to be taken care of as far as that. But it's a trap, too. You start relying on people sending you or giving you stuff, and the next thing you know, well, there's no real reason to get a good job or to get educated or any of that stuff. But, oh well. What three areas were created and expanded under the Great Society? Well, first was Medicaid, basically medical care for the poor. And then Medicare, medical care for the elderly and the disabled. And then finally, education. Got a lot of grants for education. We expanded education quite substantially during the Great Society. This was the reason for creating the Department of Education in the early 70s, because so much money was going to education. So we're trying to do that. So Medicaid, Medicare, and education were the three things that we expanded under the Great Society. And this is when the federal government really started putting money into education as far as that goes, especially higher ed. It was one of the bigger areas they got to. Then Richard Nixon comes in. He wanted to stop the Great Society, but he wasn't much of a domestic president. He came in wanting to be a foreign policy president, and yet, and he was very good at foreign policy, probably one of the best foreign policy presidents we've ever had. Look what happened in China and the USSR. He got this strategic arms limitation treaty with the USSR. He got open door policy with China. They had shut their doors after World War II, and he finally went over there and opened it back up and started some trade with them. Of course, that was supposed to be a distraction from Watergate, where he'd messed up. Watergate was his big failure, although he didn't know about it when it first started. Basically, some people downstairs in the basement of the White House, the supposedly dirty tricks department, went and broke into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate office buildings to try and see what their strategy was going to be. And they got caught. And but when Nixon finally heard about it, he tried to cover it up. And that's usually what happens with most politicians. When they hear about something, they try and cover it up. If he just would have said, okay, I heard about it, I'm sorry, it'll never happen again, people have been fired, stuff has been rearranged, so it won't. Yeah, there would have been a firestorm, and he would have got some bad press, but he probably would have survived until the end of his presidency. As it was with Watergate, and it covered up, and next thing you know, they're starting impeachment proceedings against him, and rather than get impeached, he decided to resign. And then we had our only non-elected president. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned, and he was replaced by Gerald Ford. So when Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford became our president. He was the minority leader in the House before he became VP and then became president. He did try and run for re-election. He was the nice guy, but nice guys usually finish last, and that was his problem. He was too nice. Presidents have to have a little bit of a backbone, and They can't be nice all the time. And that's what Ford was. He wanted to be your friend all the time. Works great for Congress, but not so much for the presidency. And that opened the door for Jimmy Carter. Of course, being a Republican, when people hated Republicans at the time, didn't really help either. So that helped Jimmy Carter a lot. He was the governor of Georgia. Nobody really knew who he was. He had a big smile and all this. Most people knew him as a peanut farmer from Georgia, but he actually had another occupation before that. And what was that? No, not a rocket scientist, not a teacher, although he did teach some Bible study on Sundays, but that wasn't, he didn't get paid for it. That was just for that. Not a race car driver and not a painter. Yes, he was a nuclear engineer. He had gotten his degree at Annapolis. He was a Navy guy, and he went into the Navy after his 4 years at Annapolis, and they basically trained him to be a nuclear engineer with all the physics. He was there studying the reactor they had in the USS Enterprise, or he was there studying the Nautilus, the nuclear submarine Nautilus, so they could put reactors in the USS Enterprise, the first nuclear carrier. And he liked the Navy life, and his wife Rosalind did too. So when his mother called and said, "Your dad's not doing well, we need you to come home and take care of the farm," he really didn't want to go, but family obligations being what they were, he said, "Yeah, okay, I'll come home." He almost got divorced over it. Rosalind loved the Navy life, didn't really want to go with him, but she loved her man more than the Navy life, so she went with him. She was actually sort of the one to push him into politics after that. So yeah, he was a peanut farmer and a nuclear engineer. And that's my one piece of advice to everybody. Never, ever, ever vote for an engineer. I don't care what party they are. Hoover was an engineer. Carter was an engineer. Carter was pretty good with foreign policy, but domestically he was a mess. He was even worse than Nixon. So, and then Hoover, he was there trying to get things, stop the Great Depression, and that didn't work either. So never, ever vote for an engineer. That's my one piece of advice to everybody. Then, of course, Carter tried to run, but he lost out to Ronald Reagan, who came in with the grandiose presidency that he was known for. He really had a big state up his sleeve. He was a successful governor from California, and California loved him. So when he ran for president, they all voted for him. And that was 52 electoral votes that he could put in his back pocket that normally went to Democrats. So Democrats were going to have to make up those 52 electoral votes before they could even think about winning. And of course, Carter couldn't do that. So Reagan had an easy time of it, not only this time, but the second time he ran for re-election. His main area of concerns were cutting taxes, which he's known for. Also, increasing defense spending. Everybody would vote for increasing the military, which he became now as a mainstay of the Republican Party. But he also wanted to decrease social services, and that was going to be hard to get under control with Congress because Democrats are still controlling Congress. So they would vote for his tax cuts, they would vote for his increased military spending, but they wouldn't vote for his decreased social services, which was to supposedly pay for the first two. Without the decrease in social services, we saw the debt start to rise under Reagan, and people got kind of nervous. After 2 terms of Reagan, they went with his vice president, George H.W. Bush, and he was riding high. Before his son, he actually had the highest job approval rating of any president right after the first Persian Gulf War, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and we went in and pushed them back. And a lot of people thought that after that, which was in early March, that there was no way George H.W. Bush would lose. And yet he did, because he couldn't connect with the people. He was a former spook, CIA director, and he was an introvert, and he just couldn't really connect with the general public. He tried, but he just didn't. Where Reagan could connect to everybody, and a lot of people always called Reagan the great communicator because people felt like they were talking right to him. That really wasn't the case with Bush. And then people were also worried about the debt under Bush because Reagan came in with like a $2 trillion debt, and he doubled it by the time he was finished. So it was a $4 trillion debt. When Bush was finished, it's 4 years, just 4 years. he doubled it again. It was a little over $7 trillion, almost doubled it again. So a lot of people were really worried about that. So it was he couldn't connect with the people, and they were worried about the debt. And of course, out of nowhere was William Jefferson Clinton, the governor of Arkansas. But what really probably put the nail in Bush's coffin was the third-party candidate that came to the front, which was Ross Perot. And P-E-R-O-T, Ross Perot. Most people thought that he pulled votes away from Bush. He got 19% of the popular vote in this election that Bush was running in 1988, and 1992, and he pulled off 19% of the vote, which most people thought that they probably would have voted for Bush had they not voted for Perot. So if Perot hadn't have been there, Bush would have had a better shot at winning. Even though Clinton didn't get 50% of the popular vote, he got enough wins in the Electoral College to become president. Same thing happened his second term. Ross Perot ran again. He pulled 9% of the popular vote that time. Clinton was hoping to get 50% of the vote, but he didn't. Got 49 point something, but still got the presidency a second time. Clinton had high approval ratings, even though the presidency went back to the Republicans. He was 6 years of Republican-controlled Congress under Clinton, and yet he was still able to get things done. How did he do that? He made Republican problems his problems. Every president does a radio broadcast. I think that's on Saturday, and you can actually read it online if you ever want to look at it or listen to it. But they talk about what they've done during the week and anything's coming up, and talk about this, that, or the other. And of course, the party out of power then has a response, and they talk about what they feel the president should be doing. And this is where Clinton really got smart, and then he started listening to those Republican broadcasts. And he basically said, oh, well, you say this is a problem. Okay, well, let's tackle it. And he basically had a solution. And the Republicans couldn't say, no, we don't think it's a problem, because they just said it was. So they had no choice but to try and work with him. They got deficits under control. Actually paid off some of the debt. When Clinton went in, it was about $7.5 trillion. By the time he was out, it was down to $6.75 trillion. So they spent a lot of money out of there. But of course, Clinton's real problem was Monica Lewinsky, and that actually got to be a problem because not because of Monica, but because of Monica's friend Linda Tripp. And of course, it's always about the money. She had a book, and she was trying to get the info out there and wanted people to buy her book so she could talk about this. And this is, of course, what got Clinton in trouble. It was actually a lawsuit by Paula Jones, which is where all this came out. Paula Jones was in Arkansas when Bill Clinton came by, and she claimed that he sexually harassed her. And, well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't ever remember the results of that case. I think he just paid her off in the end. But Linda Tripp wanted to get Monica Lewinsky on the record as far as that, so they could show a pattern of behavior. When all was said and done, they did try to impeach Clinton. They did impeach him in the House. They charged him with misconduct. Two charges went to the Senate for a trial, basically lying under oath, perjury, and obstruction of justice. Surprisingly, I thought they had him on the perjury, personally, but they only got 45 votes saying that they believe that he lied under oath, and I'm like, really? But anyway, they had him 50-50 on the obstruction of justice, even though Monica Lewinsky was on a tape. She'd been given immunity and said, he never told me to lie. He just told me never to volunteer anything. So I'm like, well, not volunteering, is that obstruction? So I don't know. Anyway, he wasn't convicted, and so he got to keep his job till the end of the presidency. Most people today look at the three impeachments that we had: Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Bill Clinton. Although the Nixon one they think was justified, but that we never really got to the finish of it because he resigned. Most people are looking at the Clinton and the Johnson presidencies really as political ploys to try and get rid of those presidents. Clinton, although people had problems with his morals, they really liked the job he was doing. He was a true delegate president. He tried to get things done that the people wanted done, and his job approval rating showed it. He was in the 60s throughout most of his impeachment and most of his presidency. So 60% approval as far as that goes. And then 2000, we get George W. Bush, one of the closest presidential races in history. It boiled down to Florida. If George W. Bush won Florida, then he won the Electoral College and became president, even though he had 250,000 less popular votes than Al Gore. Really, it's Al Gore's own fault. If he would have kept his home state of Tennessee rather than letting Bush come in and take it, then Florida wouldn't have mattered and he would have been president. So Al Gore ignoring Tennessee and just expecting them to vote for him was sort of stupid on his part. He should have got that. Anyway, we did count the votes in Florida, although it was stopped. The media did pay for those counts to finish, and either way you looked at it, George W. Bush got more votes than Al Gore in Florida, so he was technically the official winner as far as that goes. His two major successes during his first term, one was No Child Left Behind. We didn't really notice that here in Texas because that's what we were already doing. That's the value, the fun of starting things at a small school and then small state, or start it in a state, try it out, see if it works. Here's the federalism thing. And then if it does seem to work, then put it in nationwide. And that's what George W. did. It was a true bipartisan bill. He got a lot of Democrats and a lot of Republicans to push for it and push it through. Really needs some reform today. It did help a lot of states, but it also kind of screwed up a few too. So anyway, his other one was his war on terror. Say what you will on how he conducted the war on terror. We have never been successfully attacked again on American soil, unless you count the Boston Marathon bombing. So, but certainly not during Bush's fight. Certainly we were attacked outside the United States, but we went into Afghanistan first to get rid of the Taliban. Next we went into Iraq. We also created Homeland Security, which created the Transportation Security Administration. This is all against what Bush said he would not do when he was candidate. He said, I would not nation build, I don't want to go to war, and I don't want to increase the bureaucracy, and ended up doing all three. But that's the problem you run into. When you're a candidate, it's easy to say stuff, but when you are the president, you are basically at the mercy of what happens in the world when you are president. So after 9/11, he had no choice, really. He didn't want to. They tried to create Homeland Security before 9/11, but he said no. After 9/11, the pressure was too great, and we did it. All those guards at the airports is what basically grew our bureaucracy by 25%. Then, of course, like I said, we went into Afghanistan, went into Iraq. We basically decimated both places. We tried to put our own government into Iraq, let them create their own while we basically settled it down. We were going to do that in Afghanistan, but they're just a real mess. So I don't know how that one's going to go. Unfortunately, deficits got out of control again under his presidency. Once again, like I said, $6.75 trillion. By the time he was done, basically he added another roughly $4 trillion to the debt for his 8 years in office. So another $0.5 trillion every year for those 4 years. But then, of course, Obama's done almost eight more trillion since then, and he's only been in office 6 years. So yeah. Anyway, he didn't really do much his second term, and most presidents don't. Their second term is usually their worst, which is kind of weird because that's when they actually have all their people in place. But he tried to reform Social Security. That didn't work. Abu Ghraib was a Iraqi prison, and they found that the people were abusing them there. And then after Katrina, all that. So after 9/11, George W. had the highest approval rating of any president, even beat his dad, which was like 95, 96% job approval rating after 9/11. At the same time, he ended up with the lowest approval rating of any president in our history, which is around 28% by the time he got out. So he was the highest and the lowest at that point. Okay, I'm going to stop this video here. Hopefully I'll be able to get it up, and I will continue on with the next video later. All right, talk to you then. Bye-bye.